Live your life within the moment. And don't go wait until the morning. You never know when it is over. All that I know is we'll get older. So let us dance this night
And before we begin today's episode, please listen to the following important public service announcement from the late and Honorable Judy Heumann. Judy is the former United States Assistant Secretary of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Clinton administration and the former U.S. State Department Special Advisor for International Disability Rights in the Obama administration. Recently, Judy starred in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp.
Hello, my name is Judy Heumann. I'm here today to encourage you to please take your COVID vaccine. And if you have friends and family that haven't, please encourage them also. COVID is to be taken seriously. In addition to taking the vaccine, please use other protective methods. Wear a mask, use gloves, and sanitize frequently. If you need additional information and you live in Eastern Oregon, you can contact EOCIL. Thank you, and protect yourselves and the community.
Welcome everyone to Voices in Action, a podcast by Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living, a global disability resource and advocacy center, and I'm your host, Amador Perez. Over the course of seasons 2 and 3, we're going to be covering a variety of topics that relate to EOCIL's core priorities, and these include but aren't limited to disability actionable research, HIV prevention and harm reduction services, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ advocacy and services. And there's a wide variety of other services and programs that we provide. So I encourage everyone to check us out online at www.eocil.org, or you can check us out on any of our social media platforms, whether it be Facebook or Instagram, and interact with us through there. We're going to be speaking with individuals with lived experiences, leaders of global and local advocacy organizations, and people responsible for developing and implementing policies that affect our daily lives. And we're going to be learning from each other along the way. And today I will be speaking with Tanagra, the Director of National Capacity Building over at the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And I was lucky enough to actually meet her in person at the Intermountain Harm Reduction Conference that was held in Salt Lake not too long ago. Tanagra, thank you so much for being here and being a part of our podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me to join you in conversation today. I'm really excited for this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on here and I reached out right away was during this conference that I just mentioned that happened in September over in Salt Lake in Utah was really moving for me. And I could tell it was really moving for a lot of people. You presented over the stigma that people face around harm reduction, around people who use substances. And it was really moving for me hearing your story, hearing the impact that you guys have had, and even like all the other presentations that I was able to participate in during that 3 days that we were there. It was just amazing. And I really wanted to have you on here so that way, we can share even more information about what it is that you do and what harm reduction is, because I felt like you really had a good understanding of how to express stigma in the harm reduction field. And I know that's kind of hard for some people to grasp around or kind of fully wrap around their heads as to like what stigma actually is for people who use substances. So Tanagra, could we start off by possibly like then just introducing where it is that you work and what you do there?
Yes, absolutely. So I work for the National Harm Reduction Coalition. We have been in existence for 29 years. We're going to turn 30 next year in 2024. Originally, we started in Oakland, California, and our organization was started by a group of people who use drugs, who were being left out of conversations that were being had at both the local state, and national levels around the impact of HIV in people's lives. And people who use drugs were being directly impacted by this pandemic at the time, and yet they were not being included in these conversations. And due to the absence of public health or the medical field or anybody in terms of responding to their needs, they decided that what they should do and could do was to organize, to then work together as a collective, as a force, like a united force, right? To find space, to create space in those environments, and to really bring forth, the needs of people who use drugs, and to fight for a place at the table. And so out of that, National Harm Reduction Coalition was founded, and we've been around since then. We focus mostly in two primary areas. We are the work that we do most of the time is capacity building through technical assistance and training. And so I am really lucky that I get to either travel through Zoom or travel in person across the United States, colonies and territories, to work with people who are interested in either establishing and or expanding harm reduction services in their communities. And we also have a unit or a division of our organization that does work around policy and advocacy, because we also see ourselves as community organizers, because harm reduction started as a community organizing effort by people who use drugs and their loved ones. And we really believe in the ethos and the practice of harm reduction in that way, and think that we need to organize communities and bring also awareness to communities about what harm reduction is and how harm reduction can actually help communities be healthier and safer.
Yeah,
because there's, we've had conversations, and I know that you are aware of this, that there is a perception that is connected, as you were saying, to stigma and fear around people who use drugs. And so a lot of our work around the policy and advocacy wing of our organization is to really create that awareness, raise that awareness through education, and also to be involved in supporting legislation that will continue to strengthen the rights of people who use drugs, and also to organize against legislation that may be harmful to folks who use drugs, because if it's harmful to people who use drugs, eventually it will be harmful to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's amazing. And it sounds like you guys do so much around everywhere. I know here at the organization that I work for, it's a little bit more localized in rural parts of Oregon, but you guys seem to branch out everywhere. Do you guys have like a particular like office location that you guys run kind of all your operations from, or you guys just spread out everywhere?
So we have, there's two main offices or two hubs, right? And then there's people like me and other folks that are in different parts of the continental United States and territories. And we have an office in California, in the San Francisco and the Bay Area. And we have an office in New York City. When the pandemic hit in 2020, and we also had begun to move towards our hiring processes to hire people from different parts of the country. So we have colleagues that are in the South, we have colleagues in the Midwest. I am based out of San Juan, Puerto Rico. So we have folks in different parts of the country, right? And that is great because it brings great geographic diversity to our work. I think that there's a lot more to the United States than both coasts, right? And I think that like having awareness about Southern work, the rural work, the Intermountain West work that is happening, it really helps us to understand how harm reduction can be conceptualized and applied in all of those different settings. So yeah, so we have two main offices, and then we have folks like me who are sort of spread out, in different parts of the country.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. And then so through that, you're able to provide trainings, you're able to educate, help be a kind of like an advocate. And how did you get involved in this?
Well, I always say that harm reduction found me, and when it found me, I fell in love with it. So many years ago, I did my bachelor's degree. I left Puerto Rico, which is where I'm born and raised, and I went to school in Massachusetts. And I graduated and I started doing community organizing work in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is a small community in the western part of the state. And through that work, I got connected with folks that were working in the HIV prevention field. And I decided that I wanted to merge both or interconnect both my community organizing work with the HIV prevention work. And so I started working for a small organization called CEPA, Centro de Educación, Prevención y Acción, Center for Education, Prevention, and Action. It was a community-based organization that did community organizing work through a popular education. We use that methodology in the community. We also offered a drop-in center space for folks. We offered case management groups for people from the community that may be at risk of contracting HIV or AIDS, whether through sex work or through substance use. And I was able to go to a conference that this organization used to put together many years ago. It was a large organization called AMFAR, which is something. AMFAR, and I'm not good with acronyms, but it's a huge conference. So I flew to San Francisco flew to San Francisco from Holyoke, Massachusetts with my colleague Gree, and the keynote speaker the first morning was this woman. Her name was Edith Springer. And she was from the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And when she spoke to us about what harm reduction was, it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, like, why are we not doing this? Why are we not applying this? Why are we not working from this framework? Why are we not internalizing this as part of what we do every day? And so I left and my mind was blown. And when we got back to Holyoke, one of the things that we did was talk to the Department of Public Health, the State Department of Public Health, and ask if we could bring Edith to do trainings for us. And we were able to do that. And that's how I first got connected to Harm Reduction Coalition and also to the practice and the philosophy of harm reduction. Edith was the person responsible for bringing harm reduction to the United States. Harm reduction originated in Europe, actually in Liverpool, in a program called Merseyside, which is a program that was originated and structured by people who use drugs for people who use drugs as a response to the rising HIV and hepatitis C rates in that time in the 80s. Also, there was a huge economic crisis in Great Britain at that time because they had a really conservative prime minister, Margaret Thatcher, who had like come in and really rolled back a lot of the public health and social justice programs that had been established by the previous government. And so that really led people to be thrown into a lot more poverty. There were less access to resources and people were being hit hard, right? And so these folks organized and they came up with what harm reduction is. And so Edith from the United States went to England and met with them and was blown away. Edith was a social worker and a person who identified as a person who used drugs, and she brought back the structure, the principles, the philosophy, and the practice, and brought it together to the harm reduction working group that was created. And that's how we, through that creation of that harm reduction working group, was, the first sort of like small steps of harm reduction in the United States, and from there, National Harm Reduction Coalition is born about 4 years after, or 5.
Oh wow! So rapid turn events. Yeah, I remember hearing that story. And was it you that presented that
Yeah, at the conference,
showing the pictures of everything? Because I never heard of the term harm reduction until I started working here. And I mentioned this several times throughout my different episodes, but yeah, harm reduction was something that I was never aware of. I always thought it was just something that was just kind of there in the background. No one really cared or really understood what it was, but understanding the origins of it and the history that it was actually created by people who use substances, and that's a really powerful word choice, is people who use substances, and destigmatizing the actual language that we use, not just drug users, but people who use substances. How do you explain that to people, and the significance of understanding that language, it can be stigmatizing, and using the right language affects so much that we do?
You're so right. I think language is really powerful because, as we know, language constructs our reality, right? We make sense of our reality through language. That's how we connect to others. That's how we build relationships. That's how we understand the world. And I think the shift, and even in harm reduction, when I started in harm reduction, we did not use person first or people first language. I remember we used to use IDUs, intravenous drug users, right? We
Yeah.
used to call folks IDUs. Um, and I think that shift has happened because we want to have folks understand that people are more than their behaviors. A person who uses drugs is a person first, because if we don't put the person first, it's really easy for us to dehumanize people, and part of dehumanizing people is also shaming them and stigmatizing them. And so it's important to recognize that there's a person, a human being in front of us, that may be a parent, that may be a sibling, that may be an uncle, that may be an artist, that may be a musician, that may be an accountant, that may be a truck driver, that may be a doctor, that could be a nurse, that could be a community, that is a community member, that is loved by other people, and also happens to use drugs, right? So drug use is one aspect, and maybe not the most important aspect of who that person is,
Yeah.
or of that person's life. And so I think that's just like such an important reminder that when we're looking at people, we need to really look at people and see them as people first.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I remember you used the phrase, coming from a place of love.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is harm reduction is coming from a place of love and understanding. It took me a while to wrap my head around that as well. I mentioned before in other podcasts again, that I used to look as people who use drugs as filthy, dirty, lazy humans
Mm-hmm.
that didn't want to get better. And it wasn't until
Yeah.
I put myself in this position where I'm working at that I fully understood the harm that I was doing, not only to
Mm-hmm.
the people that I was thinking about and talking about, but to myself and how I viewed the world,
Yeah.
how negative that light was making it.
Mm-hmm.
So through understanding that, how then do you correlate, talking to people about stigma and helping them understand
Yeah.
the different stages of being
Mm-hmm.
stigmatized?
Yeah. I really appreciate what you just shared, because I think it's really truthful, right? All of us are socialized within systems that want us to dehumanize people, that are engaging in behaviors that we are scared of or we see as moral failings, right? Like that somehow drug use is a moral failing. That's all we hear. And it makes us think of people who use drugs are dirty, as bad, all those things. All of us are socialized to think that, right? That's the norm. So finding harm reduction and giving ourselves the opportunity to really, through harm reduction, reframe the way that we view substance use and other behaviors that may be challenging to us, that may be considered illegal. It's a tool, it's a way for us to then change the way that systems and the way that we operate, right? I think that I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's really honest. We're not born into harm reduction. Most of us find harm reduction many years later in life. And so for me, when I think of stigma, I think of stigma as something that starts with our thoughts, right? And you just said that. We start thinking about people that are different than us and scare us bad things, with negative things. We think people who use drugs are criminals. People who use drugs are lazy. People who use drugs are bad parents. People who use drugs are liars, right? And from thinking, then we move to believing, right? We move to the heart, and then we start believing that people who use drugs cannot change, that people who use drugs cannot be honest, that people who use drugs cannot take care of themselves or their families, right? And from thinking and believing, then we move into actions. And that's what we see, right? What we see in the world are the actions, right? Whether we say out loud, I don't want in my community this treatment center, or I don't want my kids to be playing with that person's kids, or I don't want my loved one to get married to that person, right? To institutional, right? There's a social stigma,
Yeah.
which is sort of like, the way that we treat people who use drugs or their family, right? And how we start shaming them and pushing them aside, and that leads to them losing opportunities, losing social status, being seen as less than. And then there's a piece around the institutional discrimination, right? And that's why we have situations where we may not hire someone with past or present lived experience of substance use. We may not hire someone that may have had to interact with the criminal justice system, for example, and may have a criminal record or may have a history of like being in and out of those systems.
Yeah.
And we just don't open up those opportunities for them to be hired to bring in their expertise. Or we may inadvertently also stigmatize people institutionally by treating them differently than we would treat other participants. For example, I had a participant once that had to go into a building, and the building had a metal detector, and they knew that, and they also had a guard. And he went in, he was going to an office for an appointment that I had scheduled for him. And so he went through and he put his things, he went through, and the guard started following him. And the guard was not following anyone else. The guard followed him until he got to the office he was going, and that guard was there when he finished to escort him out. And that made him feel so bad and so ashamed and so embarrassed, because he realized very quickly that the only reason that that person was treating them that way was because of their perception of who they were.
Yeah.
Right. Nothing else. And so I think that that's the kind of stigma is really it's dangerous, it's pernicious, it's harmful, because stigma kills people. It kills people every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that you were fortunate enough to like be able to travel to different parts of the country. What's the general consensus that you have on why people like what stigma looks like in different areas? Because I know here stigma is a lot, and especially in Ontario, is a visual thing. They see people, they think they're dirty. But in other areas, I've heard that it's a social thing, where it's like if people find out that I use, I go from, I think, was it yourself too, that from being the best mechanic, I am now just a drug user. That was absolutely beautiful. And if you can like actually retell that story, because I thought that was amazing. That actually lit something up inside me when you said that, because it just instantly clicked and makes sense, because that's what I would think. If someone claimed to be the best and they all of a sudden are shown to be a drug user, I'd be like, oh, well, he's just that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you a story. I have a friend who is an attorney, and he is fully covered with tattoos, that if he wears like his suit when he goes to court, no one can see them, right? He's fully covered with tattoos, arms, body, legs, everything. And you just, like the only things that are not tattoos are his neck, his face, and his hands and his feet. And so when he goes to court, no one knows that he is tattooed. One time he was out in his personal time somewhere, and he was in a shirt and shorts, and he ran into a judge that he had, gone into, I don't know how you say that in English, but when you go in to make an argument as an attorney. And the judge looked him up and down, and he was like, I would have never guessed that you would look like that, right?
Yeah.
Equating his smarts, equating a really amazing attorney, his profession, his professionalism was no longer the same, because somehow he had seen that he had tattoos, right? So I think that, we are really quick to make judgments about people that are different than us, because we don't understand why they are different than us. And fear prevents us from having those conversations and engaging in connecting with people, to be able to explore from a place of empathy. Why would someone want to be what drives him to have those tattoos? What do those tattoos signify for him? Like, what do they mean, right? And why would we think that because someone is tattooed, they're not prepared or no longer capable to go into court and to represent a client and do their work the same way that they were doing it before, right? And the same thing with stigma in other ways, right? That quote was from a presentation that they did at the Intermountain Harm Reduction Conference, and it was they had interviewed participants that were receiving services, and that's one. And their idea was to see how comfortable the participants felt with accessing services. And one of the things that this participant said is that they were really hesitant for their information to come out into the community, or for some people to know that he was a person who used drugs, because as soon as they knew that, instead of being perceived as like a really capable mechanic, probably the best in Salt Lake, what he would be perceived was as like words he uses as a junkie, right?
Yeah.
And like that's a real fear that people have because it happens. We've seen
Oh
it
yeah.
happen.
It happens really often actually. And that conference really opened my eyes. And I still to this day do that, especially when I see people. That example of that you mentioned about the tattoos. If I see someone with particular tattoos, my mind doesn't think that they could be anything other than what that stigmatized person
Mm-hmm.
is or capable of. And
Yeah.
that's something that I'm still working on doing, is treating
Yeah.
everyone as a person who knows what those tattoos signify for that individual, who knows
Yeah.
anything about their life. I don't know anything other than the first thing that I see. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that's like really powerful and jarring to hear that this person who thinks so highly of themselves, holds such a high position, can all of a sudden be seen as nothing,
Mm-hmm.
depending on whether they use or not. And using
Mm-hmm.
looks different for so many different people. I recently
Mm-hmm.
had a Narcan training in a town nearby, just educating some of the community about what Narcan is, how to use it, spotting signs of overdose. And to many of their surprise, they didn't realize that even someone who comes out of back surgery or knee surgery could be addicted to opioids, and you would never know because you can't really tell signs, especially if
Mm-hmm.
it's prescription drugs that are given to the doctor
Yeah.
for a surgery. They can be
Yeah.
easily hooked and they can fall victim
Mm-hmm.
to an overdose. And that stigma that people who use substances or illicit drugs are people who live on the street, people who
Yeah.
don't have a home, don't hold a steady job, when in reality
Yeah.
it could be your aunt or uncle, someone who just recently got
Anyone.
out of surgery. Yeah. And it was really eye-opening for them. And they had never once imagined that their grandma, who just had a total knee hip replacement, could be addicted to opioids.
Mm-hmm.
So even like the small steps like that I do, I can really see the benefit. What kind of success have you seen then throughout these trainings that you provide? Is
Mm-hmm.
there, are you still finding a lot of resistance to learning to break the stigma?
Um, I think it takes time. Stigma takes time to break down because again, we're swimming in the waters of white supremacy culture, and we're swimming in the waters of dehumanization, and we're swimming in the waters of judgment every day. And so we're asking folks to do things differently, to step out of what they know and think is normal and natural, and to like consider another possibility. And so I think that there's been slow progress and change, right? In terms of bringing harm reduction into the conversation, but also it has been to our detriment, right? Because I think that when we've done that, what's happened is that it's opened the door for other people that are not people with lived experience, or people who use drugs, or people that are involved in the harm reduction community, to define what they think harm reduction is or should be for their community. For example, harm reduction is not hinged on abstinence, right? Harm reduction doesn't expect people that start services to end in abstinence. What we want, what we're hinged on, is in love, in safety, in care, and in empathy. If that person chooses through their process of building trust with us to change their relationship to a substance and choose to walk the path of abstinence, harm reduction firmly believes in supporting someone in that situation. Of course. And we have many. I have a friend who says that harm reduction programs are the number one programs in like the number one conduit to getting people into treatment, because we build relationships with people. People come to us as they are. They feel that they can be safe. They can trust us. We trust them. We believe that they have the power to make decisions. We work alongside them in partnership. And because we do that and we build that safe container, folks are then ready and able, and we meet and help them meet their needs, right? That they
Yeah.
have. Once those needs are met, then they can explore, do I want to continue this relationship with this substance in the way that I have, or do I want to shift or change it? Right. And I think is giving people the opportunity to do that is super important. What happens is when other people start coming into the conversation and start defining harm reduction in ways that were never meant to be defined, that's where the real danger for me is, because harm reduction does not expect anything else from someone that what they want for themselves. People
Yeah.
are there to make their choices, and we should be there to support folks and accompany folks and walk alongside them. And I know this is challenging.
Yeah.
It is challenging for me every day, because we're talking about behaviors that, and we know that are criminalized and penalized. And we also, from our vantage point, we can see that there are potential dangers ahead for that person, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's not to tell people what to do, but to engage them in conversation where they can start visioning or understanding or identifying or maybe talking to us because they already did identify those dangers, right?
Yeah.
And have a safe space to talk to us about them and what they think and how those dangers impact their lives in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of a couple of my community members that I work with daily. At first, it was just hi bye, and then they started coming in asking about the needle vending machine that I have. From there, it was actually accessing it, getting Narcan. Then from there, it was, so if say I want to get into recovery, where'd I go? I'm like, oh well, I have this connection right above us. They're a recovery center. You can talk to them. If not, I can kind of do some poking around for you.
Yeah.
And it's all led by them. What they want to do, I'm just there to support them. Right. And in this process that you go through all these trainings, what are like the major barriers that you see kind of throughout the nation or throughout like big cities, small rural areas?
Yeah. Well, I think that harm reduction looks different in different parts of the country because of access to resources, because of historical, issues. I think that, for example, when we think of New York and California, those are two areas that are fairly well resourced.
Yeah.
And there's a long-standing history of harm reduction in those areas. I think the West Coast, some areas, at least they're more urban areas, are better well resourced. And also, there are areas that historically have been neglected and have been overseen, ignored, and therefore harm reduction programs there operate more on the underground, they kind of skate by and offer the services and are connected to community because it's what they need to do in order to get the supplies and the services to people that need them, particularly areas that are fairly conservative, right? And I think California has very conservative areas, outside of San Francisco, LA, there's places, Oregon has very conservative areas. So, and what I mean by conservative, I mean that folks there really are coming from a place that people who use drugs don't belong in their community, that people who use drugs are bad, that they're dangerous, right? Because we are swimming in those waters, and that's the only thing that they see and hear, right? They're only in those waters. And so I have seen and had the opportunity to go to places, for example, Klamath County in Oregon, to do some trainings there. And in the beginning, folks were somewhat resistant. And at the end of the 2 days, we had folks there that were very honest about saying, the perception that I had was skewed, and I am learning, and I understand now that there's a way that I can do these things differently, and I need to continue to learn how to do this practice, and I'm going to approach people who use drugs differently, right? I think that piece of making sure harm reduction meets people where they're at, and so we need to do that. And harm reduction takes time. It takes time to build those relationships and to build that trust. And so I think across the United States, as this country is diverse, there's also great diversity in the ways that people practice harm reduction. There are parts of this country, there are states of this country that have no harm reduction services that are legal whatsoever. And so that poses a huge challenge for people who use drugs in those communities, and for the adjacent states where people may travel. For example, Wyoming doesn't have legal harm reduction services. And so folks need to travel out of state to Colorado or to Idaho, right, in Montana, to receive services if they can, which is a huge barrier, right? For prevention, there's also a lack of treatment services as well. When you see a lack of harm reduction services infrastructure, you also can see a correlation in terms of a lack of access to treatment or to recovery services, because harm reduction and recovery are part of the same spectrum. They are in relationship to each other, right? Because as Tim Santamor says, is relapses are part of the process of recovery. We have to be ready, right? And harm reduction is the space where we keep people engaged, safe, connected, and loved until they feel or want to move towards recovery and abstinence, if that's what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, especially in Idaho, it's a little bit more on the hush-hush side of, like I mentioned, some of the services have to be provided underground, kind of on the lower end. And that's what I'm trying to do, is also connecting people from Idaho, because I happen to live I live in Idaho and I worked in Oregon because we border right next to each other. It's only a
Yeah.
5 minute drive to enter Idaho, and then to get to the major city is an
Hmm.
hour drive. And a lot of people frequent that drive. So being able to connect
Yeah.
them, that's a barrier in itself. The
Hmm.
transportation, the ableism there that they can afford to come over to
Yes.
Oregon to get the harm reduction services that they need,
Yeah.
whether it be HIV prevention kits, whether it be safe sex kits, anything
Yeah.
Narcan. So that's
Yeah.
a barrier in itself. And you kind of mentioned it looks different for everyone. How have you seen the trends in like culturally from Hispanics to African
Hmm.
Americans, the way they
Yeah.
use drugs and how they interpret drug use? Because to everyone it's different.
Yes, you're right. I think historically, Black and Brown and Indigenous people have been the most impacted by the war on drugs and by the persecution of people who use drugs. We know that. And the more we prohibit and the more we persecute, the more that we push people into into the margins, right? The less we see it, and the more we expose people to harms, right? Because people have to share equipment, because people may have to, in order to get the substances they need, they may have to get into hustles that are not safe, right? And we know that for a fact, that it's not drug use that kills you, it's the hustle to get the substances, because you're not able to get employed because you have a criminal record, and
Yeah.
immediately you're discounted. And it's a cycle, right? I had a participant. He came out of prison, he did his time, he came out, he couldn't get housing because he needed an address to get housing.
Yeah.
And he couldn't get an address because he had a criminal record. He couldn't go to school to study because he had a criminal record. And at one point he came to me and said, you know what? F it. I'm going to go back to selling drugs, because that's the only thing that I can do right now at this point to be able to get a house, to move forward, right? So we're
Yeah.
pushing people back into the system because we need that prison industrial complex, because there's a lot of money in prisons. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of capital that it's generated, and that makes people rich. And so because of that, we start seeing how we are building out the structures that are keeping brown, Black, and Indigenous people out. We have seen in California, for example, and in New York, for example, that the rates of overdose are the highest amongst Puerto Ricans and Latinos. So we're seeing overdose rates higher in Black, Brown, Black, Latino, and Indigenous folks. Also rates of HIV, HCV, which is hepatitis C. There's also issues around, actually, it was a study that came out recently that the rates among Native Americans and Native Alaskans or Indigenous folks, the rates of hepatitis C are the highest in the country, and they're not the largest portion of the population. So it's significant because we're talking about a smaller sector of the population that has the highest percentage of cases. Something is happening. Right.
Yeah.
And what is happening is racism, is discrimination, is stigma, is criminalization of people. It's not really approaching people from a culturally humble lens.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that I love that I've seen in the past couple of years, speaking of trends, is harm reductionists from Indigenous communities defining harm reduction for Native people. And so Clinton Alexander, who's part of the White Earth Nation out in Minnesota, many years ago was a visionary, and he got together with a small group of Indigenous folks from across the country and decided to organize the first ever Native Harm Reduction Conference. 30 people showed up. 30 people showed up. Move forward 10 years later, more than 2,000 people, Indigenous people, Native people showed up and it's amazing to engage in conversation about harm reduction, a harm reduction that is rooted in the ethos, in the beliefs, in the religious and spiritual beliefs of Native folks, right? And it's not to say that it's been easy, right? It's been challenging, and they have been able to create that space that speak to Native folks, right? And to Native folks in different parts of the country too. There's a colleague of ours, Annette Hubbard, who is in Homer, Alaska, and she runs the Alaska Natives Harm Reduction Coalition there, and does amazing work both in the recovery field and also in supporting folks that are not necessarily ready or willing or able to engage in recovery at this moment, and want to continue to try to be as safe as they can by connecting them to harm reduction services. And what I love about that is that is rooted again in the culture of the people who are receiving the services, and is rooted also in harm reduction. The same thing with Latinx folks. We are at the National Harm Reduction Coalition. We've had, when I came in, I was the only person that spoke Spanish. And so I immediately understood that having information about overdose, information about prevention, information about harm reduction in Spanish would save lives. Right now we have more staff. So now ahora sí tenemos un montón de gente que habla español. We have a ton of people that speak Spanish across from different spectrums. We have colleagues that are, their roots are in Mexico. We have a colleague of ours that is Ecuadorian Cubana. We meet with Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico. We have our national director, Laura Guzman, who is from Argentina. So I'm sure I'm forgetting another of our colleagues. I'm trying to think about, it's like Jose, my colleague Jose, who is from New York. So we have many folks in the organization that speak Spanish, and we have been able to start with, or also colleagues from Puerto Rico acting as consultants, to start building out our Spanish resources and do trainings in Spanish for community in the language that they feel most comfortable with.
Wow.
That is super important.
Yeah, and what do those trainings in Spanish look like? Or what are they about?
So we do all of our trainings that we normally do for our trainings, courses that we do for community in general. We have done a process of transculturation. So we've taken them, and instead of like directly translated them, what we're doing is that we're ensuring that we are interpreting the material in a way that will reach the people. So it's Spanish, but it's a Spanish that is understood by folks from the community. In California, most of our folks are from Mexico y America Central. And we have some Caribbeans interspersed. And then in the East Coast, we have mostly, we have a lot more diversity in the sense that we have the Caribbean there. We have also Central America. We have South America. So we have created those trainings in Spanish. It's the same information, but also in a language and using the terminology that our communities use to be able to engage people in the thinking and the discussion in a language that feels comfortable and safe to them.
And that's what I love, because I've noticed that's here in this area, whereas when they don't have people who speak Spanish or are from that culture, they'll just go to Google Translate. It doesn't correlate the same, especially the different areas that people speak Spanish. Someone from Argentina does not speak the same Spanish that someone from Mexico speaks.
Exacto.
So I love hearing that, because that's what I've been trying to do instead of just going translating word for word, is that these words have meaning and power. Make sure that translates over to the Hispanic population so that it has the same meaning and power to them, that way it connects with them on a personal level, rather than just entering it into Google or whatever translation machine you have, to where you get this weird robotic sounding form, which no one would really actually speak that way. And that's something that we've been working on here at EOCIL, is instead of just entering stuff into the computer, it's giving it personality, giving it its touch to the community that we have around here. Especially here, a majority of the population is from Mexico, either Californian raised, first generation Hispanics, or migrants from Mexico. We don't have a lot of other Cubans, though there are some. We don't have that many. So it's going to look different, the language that we use. And that's really, really pivotal.
And community, I just wanted to say also that is really important, what you just said, and I want to uplift it. And for us as harm reductionists, we would look at your community as the experts, and we would go and consult them. And if we're consulting them, we have to make sure that we're also remunerating them for their expertise, right? Because that is super important. All of these trainings, we brought in community when we brought community to help us with the interpretation and translation, to make sure that the language and the terminology was appropriate. We paid for folks for that, because it's their labor and it's their expertise that they're sharing with us. So I love that you just brought that up.
Yeah, and especially and I remember hearing that as well in those meetings, and even this other meeting that I attended in Portland for the HIV continuum of care. It was the same thing. Is paying the people what they're due. They're the ones providing us the information. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
have it. They needed it. We could have hired a professional who had the opportunity to go to school. We can pay them when we don't pay the people who actually live that experience, who are part of that
Mm-hmm.
community day in and day out, who didn't have the
Yeah.
benefit of going to school and studying it. They just know it because they lived it for their entire life. And we
Yeah.
just ask them for favors and don't actually repay them in any type of fashion other than a thank you, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is which I think is going to take time to change that and get people like on that
Yeah.
train, is that they are the experts, like you mentioned. They
Mm-hmm.
know way more than I would know. Granted, everyone's experience is different. My
Mm-hmm.
my use with substances is completely different. The reasons that I use, what I use, how
Mm-hmm.
much I use, how it affected me in my personal life and in my work
Yeah.
life, vastly differs from anyone
Yeah.
else. So I think that's really, really, really important to understand. So
Mm-hmm.
that leads me to my next question. Like, through these trainings, how many new areas of harm reduction are you seeing throughout the country where people are starting to develop their own harm reduction program in their state or in their city?
So we are working with folks also within states, right? That we're seeing that folks, there are states where there's harm reduction only in one part of the state, usually a city that is mostly urban. And we're seeing, for example, programs start in more rural areas. We are seeing, for example, in the South, programs in Tennessee, in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. We have underground programs in Alabama. We have underground programs in Mississippi, right? When I mean underground, West Virginia, there's official programs and also there's underground programs. The other thing that we've seen that is really beautiful and we want to support is something that addresses some of the challenges that you brought up earlier around having to travel when there's a vacuum in the state around harm reduction, which is secondary exchange, right? Or peer secondary led exchange, which is folks that are able, because they have a vehicle and they have access, they can go into a program and they can get equipment and get information and materials, and they bring it back to the community and they disperse it to all their networks of people that they know. And those folks are amazing and they are doing such an important service, right? Because they're keeping people safe, they're connecting people with resources, and they're bringing in information and training. Those are the folks that will go in and will do the naloxone trainings, and they will be able to provide the materials and the information. They can connect people to other services. And so I think that piece of secondary exchange has been a life-saving tool, because they also can get connected to programs that are better resource, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes it's not feasible for a program to start a second program or a second wing of that program in a particular area because of costs or because of prohibition, etc. And they can work with a participant that lives in that community that is willing to bring back those materials for folks that live there.
Yeah, and that's some of the like that secondary exchange. That's how a lot of my community members I currently work with found out about me. Was I made a
Mm-hmm.
connection with one, that one loved that the fact that we were doing harm reduction, that we were providing these services. They spread it to their friends. They ended up picking up 20, 30 needles from me and dispersing it to their 10 friends, and then their
Mm-hmm.
friends finally got comfortable enough to come into my office.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's how it's been branching out to where now I almost know everyone in the community, whether they be homeless, whether they be people who use substances.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest thing is having that confidentiality too. I will never
Mm-hmm.
share any of their information, what they came in for. They could
Yeah.
have came in because they were thirsty and wanted water. Like, and I
Exactly.
still wouldn't share that information with anyone who asked why
Mm-hmm.
they came into my building.
Yeah.
It's that sense of trust that the people need and
Mm-hmm.
haven't been given for a very long
Yeah.
time. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask, so you mentioned, I think you said Virginia, was it? That
Yeah. The
is a
state of
little more,
Virginia.
yeah. So in terms of like legislation or laws and advocacy, how do you help in that aspect? And what are you guys currently doing to help promote the uplifting of harm reduction services throughout the country?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we have a policy and advocacy wing in the organization that currently has a director that is based out of California, but does a lot of does all the national work. And we have two staff embedded both in Tennessee and in Texas, which are states that have requested support trying to move legislation to establish or expand services. We also have another person who's embedded in the Midwest and is addressing adjacent states that don't necessarily have harm reduction. Like Nebraska doesn't have any official harm reduction services. If I'm not mistaken, Arkansas and Oklahoma don't have any. North Dakota has harm reduction services, but South Dakota doesn't have any harm reduction services at all. They're also moving to support folks. We are working in Wyoming, and we have been working with the Department of Health of Wyoming for about 4 years now to support them in building the infrastructure that can help them to eventually have harm reduction services in the state. And we're supporting a collective of folks that does this work underground across the state. We've also done work with folks in Oregon. We've done work with folks in Washington State. We've done work, as I mentioned, with North and South Carolina. South Carolina is also a state that has harm reduction services, and they're underground. There's no legal harm reduction services in the state. Georgia is another state that only has one program, and we're supporting, and we, from our work and our support, the same as Virginia. Virginia's legal. And we have a really good relationship with Bruce. I forget Bruce's last name. Bruce is amazing. And Bruce is the harm reduction specialist embedded in the Department of Health that supports the programs. And so we've seen the establishment of programs in other parts of Virginia, more rural parts of Virginia. And as I was saying, we've also been involved since the very beginning. I don't know if you're familiar with Scott County, Indiana. In 2015, the CDC raised alarm because they had seen an outbreak that they had not seen in decades of HIV in a very small community in rural Indiana, Scott County. And so when they went in, the epidemiologists and people to understand what was happening, what they realized was that people were injecting drugs and they were sharing equipment. They were filing down their syringes, which is really dangerous because they didn't have access to other equipment. And that led to groups of people, families, like a huge epicenter of an HIV and AIDS outbreak. Immediately, we were called in and we came into Indiana and we met with advocates and people who use drugs and people who were doing their best to provide harm reduction services, but they were at capacity, to start thinking with them, how could we support the establishment of legal harm reduction services in a state in a way that didn't have barriers for people? Because sometimes legality immediately means surveillance and coercion, and that leads people to really high threshold for programs and really high threshold for participants. And also there's issues with criminality, right? There is legislation that it's in place around syringes that have residue, right? So there's paraphernalia laws. There's also the absence of Good Samaritan laws. Even when we have Good Samaritan laws, as you well know, if I have a record and I have someone next to me who may be experiencing an overdose, people may be hesitant to call because they don't know if they have warrants out, what could happen. We also know that the more that they try to criminalize people who use drugs, with also issues around drug-induced homicides, right? That will create more barriers for people to be able to take care of each other, right? And that's dangerous because that's not keeping anyone safe. That's an illusion. No one is safe by charging someone with a drug-induced homicide. What we're doing is we're driving people who use drugs more into the shadows and more into danger.
I know. And that's one thing that you mentioned there about like the Good Samaritan law or the harm reduction is here. We also ran into that problem of like what's considered paraphernalia. We're given money to provide these services, and how are the law enforcement going to take that when they arrest someone or they search someone and they find these materials on them? So we developed this quick little excerpt of the actual laws, and we put it inside of all of our harm reduction kits. So that way the people who are accessing them know the law that they have, that if they get caught with this, that they aren't going to get in trouble, even if there's no residue in it. They shouldn't be questioned. They shouldn't be searched. They shouldn't be taken into custody because they have needles, because it was given to them by harm reduction services. So kind of branching from that, what things have you seen that are pretty innovative throughout the country in terms of harm reduction?
Well, in West Virginia, there is a harm reduction program inside of the fire station. And the reason is that that's a space people feel safe going to. It's a space that people congregate, and they wanted to have a harm reduction services inside there. So they do syringe exchange at the fire station. I think also something that we've seen that is innovative is, for example, in Louisiana, in New Orleans, we have colleagues that use bicycles or roller skates and backpacks to go meet people where they're at.
wow.
And to bring in equipment, which is amazing. So it's literally like hands-on outreach. I think mobile, it's not necessarily innovative. What is innovative is what they're bringing into the mobile services. There are programs that are partnering with other organizations that have resources. For example, there's a harm reduction program that is partnering with an organization that has a huge medical van, and they have been able to, through that, provide other services to participants, right? And the medical services program can get connected through trust, as you were saying, trust building, to those participants that normally wouldn't feel safe coming into the clinic, right? And so they can get screenings, they can get vaccines. I think also with COVID, another thing that we saw, thinking about vaccines, and in general with hepatitis A, it was a hepatitis A outbreaks. I always get confused with my heps. There's I think it's the hep B. There's an outbreak that we are seeing, or we have been seeing progressively, particularly when you need to wash your hands and you don't have access to clean running water or soap. And we know that for folks that are unhoused or living in housing insecurity on the streets, that's the case. They need to get a vaccination, and with that vaccination, you get people protected for that hep or that hepatitis. And they were not having success in this community because people would not trust them. And what they did was, shoot, we should partner with the harm reduction program. What happened? The harm reduction program was the ambassador. They said to them, these people you can trust, they're here. This is what the vaccine is. The same thing with COVID. You know, many of our programs were recognized for what they are, first responders connected to community, right? And I think that that's really innovative, because it shows that people who use drugs are smart, capable, and resilient, and are willing and able to take care of their community, right? And I think that we're also seeing something that I've seen that is really innovative too, that we've done historically, but more so now because we've had to, is mutual aid, right? It's organizations and people taking care of each other in the absence of a government or a state that should be doing that and is not providing it because they ignored us, right? So people showing up for each other, people really sharing resources and sharing equipment and sharing tools with each other to keep each other safe.
And then from there, that's something that us as harm reduction specialists can do. And then in terms of the community, not just the community members or people who use substances, but there's the general population. How do we step in and help support harm reduction? Is it word of mouth, spreading it? Is it signing petitions to legislation, or what have you seen do that
happen? Yes. I think that I always tell people, if you don't know your local harm reductionist, go and meet them and make friends with them. They want you to be friends with them because, most likely you know and love people who use drugs and you're not aware of it because they haven't told you and you haven't asked them. And so, and you may be working with people who use drugs and you don't know because they haven't told you and you haven't asked them. And so I think getting to know your local harm reduction program will show you that it is a space that is safe, that is community-based, that is there to support people who use drugs and many other people. When I ran my program in Holyoke, Massachusetts, we had community members that had never used drugs ever in their lives come in to use the phone, to use the computer, to watch a movie, to eat the food we cooked, to have the coffee and the pan con jamón y queso that we would do the little sandwiches and pan sobao in the morning. So before we open, we did, we prepare them, because if we didn't have that with if the coffee wasn't strong, you didn't have the sandwiches, it would be a big motif. People will get upset. So we needed to have that. People in the community came just to be in connection with each other. So harm reduction programs serve people who use drugs, and they also serve community members. I connected people to services, healthcare services, reproductive healthcare services, legal services, educational services, job services that never shut up drugs or smoked or did anything that had to do with substance use. And they saw us as a hub of activity and as a hub of information, as a hub for community connection. So I do think that, meet your harm reductionist, go to a harm reduction program, visit it, go out, be a volunteer, go out, learn how to use naloxone, have naloxone on you and carry it and use, and hopefully you don't have to use it, but if you do, you have it, right? Become more educated about the other ways that we can practice harm reduction with different communities, right? and think about the harm reduction that is culturally humble and rooted in the space that you are. I think that those are things that we all can do, right? And that it's not very difficult or hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. Because some people don't even know how to approach harm reduction. They see it, they're kind of scared. They don't know what they're gonna expect, especially
Yeah.
when they walk in the door, especially when they hear that we're giving out free needles, we're giving people
Yeah.
Narcan so that way in case they overdose, it's all right, they'll be fine. So kind
Yeah.
of that sense of enabling people who use substances kind of deters them from even asking the
Mhm.
question. That's why here where I work, and I think it's one of the key factors in why it happened was that we have the food pantry attached to our harm reduction services. That way, people come in who access the food
Mhm.
pantry who might not necessarily need the harm reduction, but they will see that what we're offering, and from there spread
Yes.
word of mouth. So stuff like that,
Mhm.
joining different departments together in
Mhm.
order to better reach our population and our community here. I also wanted to ask you then, and kind of what are the goals then in terms of like short term and then long term for harm reduction?
I think, well, I mean, short term, we need to continue to do the work that we're doing, particularly in light of recent attacks to harm reduction programs, right? We've seen more repression, more surveillance, more attacks across the United States, more concerted mobilization of groups that don't believe in harm reduction to create barriers for programs to exist. And we've seen that through lawsuits. We've seen that through challenges to the state legislatures. So it's something that we need to bear in mind and think about a long-term collective uh, advocacy campaign, so that because what we're seeing in Washington State that is coming down Portland now with Prop 110, that is coming down to California with trying to shut down programs and police saying that they're the ones who define harm reduction for harm reduction programs when they're not equipped to do that because they don't have the expertise or the knowledge to do that. That is dangerous, right? And so we see that, we see those trends, and we see how those trends slowly start moving across the country. And so we need to be prepared, because what's happening there, sadly, we will see it copy it somewhere else across the United States. And we need to figure a way that we can work with the drug users unions and with other organizing groups across the country, including organizations such as Drug Policy Alliance, that are our colleagues and friends, the Comer Foundation, AIDS United, NASTAD, right, to really think about the ways in which we can support folks in their communities to be prepared to face these challenges when they come to them, because they will come to them, right? And also, I want to remind us that harm reduction started with people who use drugs, for people who use drugs, and we did not have any of these infrastructures, and we did it, and we kept our people safe because we believe that's the right thing to do. Legality sometimes doesn't mean that it's like what is legal is not right, and many times what is right is not legal, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that we get hinged on this funding, right, because there's a lot of dependency around that. And I think we need to think about ways, that's the future for us, thinking outside of the box and thinking of ways in which programs can become more self-sustaining without necessarily having to depend on government funding. Because if that government funding comes attached with all of these requirements that will water down what harm reduction is, then we should not want it. If government funding is respectful and comes to us and allows us to do the work that we need to do the way that we want to do it, then that, I think that's perfectly fine, because I do think government has to have a role in protecting and taking care of its people, right? And I also believe that there's many times that when funding is assigned to local or state governments, what happens is that then they start getting creative in terms of defining or determining what harm reduction is, and none of that funding gets to the hands of the programs that are doing the work, and or they come with so many internal barriers that are already embedded into the way that the funding is, that they're requiring you as a program to meet, that it's impossible. So I think that those are some of the things in terms of our thinking about the future of our movement and the work that we're doing.
Well, and that's great. And that raised the question that I have is how do we then as harm reductionists keep ourselves accountable?
Mm.
Have you ever ran into problems with that when a harm reduction program isn't doing the job that they say they're doing it or have twisted what harm reduction is? How do we keep ourselves accountable?
Yeah. Well, I think it's always important to come back to the essence of what harm reduction is, right? And not forget that harm reduction is a gift that was given to us and with love by people who use drugs, right? So we need to look at ourselves and see, are people who use drugs centered? Are their voices being heard? Are we involving people not as tokens but as active participants in this movement? Are we following and honoring the principles of harm reduction? Those principles should be the lighthouse that lights our way, right? And I think every day, we wake up as people and we can only do our best that day. And there are days where I'm like, okay, my harm reduction self was not the best today. And there's always tomorrow. The important thing is to recognize that, right? Recognize that we all swim in those waters. We're not exempt from swimming in those waters. And it's only through being aware of doing things differently and choosing to do them differently that we can. Right. And I think holding ourselves accountable is like sitting up, down at the end of the day and thinking, did I honor the principles of harm reduction? Did I raise my voice and name the things that are harmful and hurtful to people who use drugs in the spaces where those were happening? Did I extend love and care and compassion to the people who are trying to do this work under resource and challenge? Was I able to be caring and empathetic and loving in the face of someone coming with swimming in the waters of all this misinformation and coming and sharing with me a perception that they have of people who use drugs? Was I able to meet them where they're at? If I wasn't, what can I do differently next time? What do I need to look at internally, right? I think that's such a good question. The question of accountability, right?
Yeah, and that's really important. And also I'll tie in also having the capacity to reflect on yourself mentally because
Mm-hmm.
it is a taxing job dealing with people's lived
Yeah.
experiences, having to relive
Mm-hmm.
your own possibly through those interactions.
Yeah.
I never thought that was like another shared experience that I have is that when I heard people complain like, oh, this job is a lot, all this, I'm like, just get over it, just do your job. How hard can it be?
Mm-hmm.
Getting into this position, oh my goodness, did that hit me like a brick wall? I soon
Mm-hmm.
then from coming to the office every day, I was like, oh, it's fine, it's fine. And then slowly I started to notice some patterns within
Mm-hmm.
my personal life. I'm like, wow, this is
Yeah.
actually really taxing. And even my CEO had presented or talked to all of our staff saying like, hey, if this is taxing, you need time for yourself. If you need a mental
Mm-hmm.
health day, take that day because
Yeah.
that will affect the way that you treat the people that you're supposed to serve. How are you supposed to serve
Mm-hmm.
someone to the best of your ability when you yourself aren't at 100%? Keeping
Mm-hmm.
myself accountable for my health so that way I can
Yes.
provide the best service to the people who need it and who are less fortunate at the time. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's really great. And I don't want to take up too much more of your time because the amazing work that you do sounds really busy. And so I really want to kind of wrap things up here. I just want to ask you, is there any final thoughts, like a final message, where to find you guys, where to go for support,
Yeah.
something you want the people to remember about harm reduction and what it is?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that. I want people to remember that harm reduction is love and that harm reduction is a gift that was given to us with a lot of love by people who use drugs, and that should be what guides us in every interaction that we engage in every day, right? The way that we can honor people who use drugs by centering the principles of harm reduction, by really trying to be better and loving ourselves, and also recognizing when we're out of our depth and we need support. It's okay to ask for help, and perfection is an illusion that capitalism and white supremacy culture has sold us, and it's not real. So it is okay to be imperfect, because harm reduction is not about perfection. It's about being human and humanity, right? And so I think being okay with being in this messiness and really not knowing everything, and being able to ask for help and being curious and connecting and working with people are things that I want folks to like, if they take anything away from this today, is that you can find us through our webpage. You can put in the search engine National Harm Reduction Coalition, or you can write us an email at training@harmreduction.org, and that information will get to us. We offer trainings and capacity building across the United States, as I said, and territories. We're always interested in hearing from folks. We have also on our webpage an area with tons of resources that are there free for folks to download and use. The only thing we ask, if you're going to tweak them, is to give credit to National Harm Reduction Coalition. And you can also go to the webpage. And if you're not already receiving our newsletter, monthly newsletter, Movement in Motion, you can register to receive it. And that way you can keep up or be informed with the latest. Our Movement in Motion is a great newsletter. It has news from the harm reduction community across the United States, job opportunities, training opportunities. So I highly encourage folks, if they're interested in knowing or learning more about harm reduction and the way that harm reduction is happening across the United States, to register to receive the newsletter.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. I'm someone that doesn't sign up to newsletters, and I remember when I first started, I stumbled across your page, immediately signed up, and I've attended so many trainings that you've sent out through those newsletters. I read all the articles that you print out on there. It's absolutely amazing.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm going to tell Brittany, our colleague Brittany Valentine, team of one. Brittany's amazing. You would think that we have a comms team of 30, and that woman is a powerhouse and really does a lovely, beautiful job with our communications, both in social media. You can follow us on Instagram, on X or Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. I think we're everywhere. We have a YouTube channel that we're giving it some love. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to tell Brittany, because she shows up with such energy and positivity and care and love every day to do this work that, as you said, can be really challenging, because we're in challenging times, and she does it beautifully. So I'll let her know. She'll be really happy to hear that.
I mean, it's really well put together. The information on there is above and beyond. And like I said, I don't ever subscribe to any subscriptions or like daily or monthly newsletters or anything like that, for the reason is like a lot of the times it's just really obsolete, doesn't really include the initial stuff. But this one that you guys send out is so impactful. The stories, the articles, the trainings, I've attended so many of yours, especially when I first started. You guys were the main source of my trainings, whether it was going to like the Narcan training, whether the harm reduction stuff, and anything else that you guys have on there. Those were kind of like my foundational in entering harm reduction. But thank you so much for that, and thank you for all the work that you guys do over there at National Harm Reduction Coalition. It was an honor to have you on here, and I look forward to attending some more of your trainings and seeing what harm reduction has for the future. As for everyone listening, thank you. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast by Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living. And as we close out today's episode, I just want to say thank you for listening. And I hope you were able to enjoy this episode and hopefully take something away from what Tanagra was able to share with us today. And if you still have any questions about what harm reduction is or the work that we do in the areas that we serve, I encourage you all to check us out online at www.eocil.org. Or you can also visit us any one of our social media platforms, whether that's Instagram or Facebook. And one of the best ways to help serve our community and help reduce stigma is by being informed. So EOCIL has 5 different office locations throughout Eastern Oregon, located in the Dalles, Pendleton, LeGrand, Ontario, and the Burns. So drop on by or give us a call, and a harm reduction specialist will be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Once again, it's been Voices in Action.